At Tech Central. Duncan, thanks very much for joining us. I suppose some welcome relief for consumers, even though the cost of data hasn't been brought down.
That's right, Peter. I think that these are quite sensible regulations from ICASA. I think that they're quite a marked shift from the draft regulations that we saw last year, the last version of which was proposing that data doesn't expire for a period of 3 years. ICASA has, I think, sensibly done away with that, although I'm sure consumers won't necessarily be happy with that decision. I think it makes sense for the industry and for the market, and ultimately for consumers as well. But there's some smart regulations here, and I think the out of bundle data issue has been one that has caught a lot of consumers off guard, and I think it's welcome that these regulations have now been put in place.
All right, so tell us a bit more about this out-of-bundle thing. I mean, you're in fact carrying over data, because that's the one thing I think a lot of people had qualms with. Do we know what period of time, or is this indefinite? What happens now?
So all they've said is that there will be rollover of data, and from what I understand, and I guess we'll get the full details when the regulations are published early next week, but from what I understand, they've left it in the hands of the operators to determine. So there has to be rollover, but the competitive market, the industry, will decide on a company by operator basis what that rollover will be. So they haven't mandated to the operators that you must roll over data for a certain period of time, which I think some of the data must fall lobbyists won't be happy with. But it probably does make sense, because if they had mandated that data, for example, can't expire for 3 years, which was contained in the last set of draft regulations, it could have unintended consequences in terms of business models and affecting the industry and also innovation, because we've seen operators coming up with some interesting models. A cheap data bundle, for example, that expires within 24 hours. I think there's even one that expires in 60 minutes. And this has in some ways allowed the operators to bring down data prices for shorter period usage. So I think it's positive that the ICASA hasn't mandated a period. I'm sure some of the data must fall advocates won't be happy with that.
And also ICASA steering clear of trying to set prices. I guess that's not something that they want to do.
They were never really going to deal with the issue of pricing in this set of regulations. They said that there are 3 phases of the process that they're going through in reducing data, the cost to communicate in South Africa, and addressing wholesale and retail prices is probably only going to be dealt with in the 3rd phase of that. I think that's going to be the trickiest issue, because I think that regulating retail prices can be very dangerous. We've certainly seen examples of where in countries where retail prices get regulated, and government says you may not charge more than this amount, and then that obviously can sometimes lead to shortages and other problems. The classic example, of course, is the situation, I suppose, in Venezuela. So I think that the regulator needs to be extremely cautious about trying to regulate retail prices in particular. I think that it makes much more sense to try and address, if the conclusion is that data prices are too high, I think it makes much more sense to try and address it at a policy level rather than a regulatory level.
And these out-of-bundle rates, I mean, what's been happening is that once you finished your contract data, you'd go out into these out-of-bundle rates, which were much, much higher. So as a business model, it was great for the mobile networks, but now they're going to start to see more revenues lost in this area.
Yes, and I think the mobile operators had this coming to them in many ways. They probably haven't responded nearly quickly enough to protect consumers who go out of bundle, and there have been instances of individuals having to fork over thousands of rands because they didn't realize that, for example, the operating system on their phone or their laptop that was connected to their phone was running an update, a large update, multi-gigabyte update, and consumers have found themselves in a situation where they're experiencing bill shock. So I think that the operators have been too slow to address this issue, and I think it's welcome that ICASA has actually drawn a line in the sand and said that out of bundle is now opt-in, not opt-out, as it is now.
All right, Duncan, that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much indeed. That was Duncan MacLeod, who's the editor of Tech Central, giving us a little bit more information on this good news for mobile telephony consumers. Your rates, out-of-bundle rates, are not going to happen. Automatically, what will happen is that you have to opt in, actually, if you want to experience out-of-bundle rates. Otherwise, you'll just have to top up once you've run out of data. Okay, let's move on to